I had a guy called Lawrence who was my number one cleaner, and as the cleaning officer I was allowed by management to get a cleaner out to clean the hot plate and clean the showers. But I also used to keep Lawrence out and make him a cup of tea and just have a chat with him for 5-10 minutes, just check he's okay and what was going on with him and with his family and stuff, and then put him behind his door. And then fast forward many decades, and I ended up being the Governor of Aylesbury, and the press office convinced me to do a programme called Aylesbury Prison. And Lawrence was sat at home, and his wife said, "That prison where you were in when you were younger is on the telly." And he said, and he came in the room and looked, and there I am, his personal officer, waxing lyrical about the prison as its governor. And bless him, having never ever heard from him, and why would you, he sent me a congratulations card. And it's one of my most treasured possessions. And basically what he said, the nicest thing about you, and the biggest thing that made such a difference, was instead of on a Sunday night giving me a cup of tea out of an urn that's had the tea in it for about 5 hours and it's lost any resemblance of tea, you'd think nothing of going in the office and getting an officer's mug. Bear in mind they had these plastic awful things. Using a Thai food tea bag, a proper tea bag, and make me a cup of tea and giving it to me. And you never thought anything of that. He said, but that was such a generous thing to me. And then it was your conversations with me for 5-10 minutes on a weekend that kept me out of trouble because I didn't want to let you down. And I just thought that was such a powerful thing. But with certain people, just those little moments of kindness can just crack open a door. And it certainly worked with him. And I just felt very grateful for the fact that he shared that with me, because it had such a profound effect on me. It still does, as you can probably tell from my voice.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Kevin Leggett is a now retired prison governor with over 30 years of service. Although originally from Durham, he began his career as a prison officer at the Young Offenders Establishment in Aylesbury, and he subsequently worked at the prisons Bullingdon, the Mount, Grendon, where I first met Kevin, and Huntercombe, as well as having executive roles for the implementation of policies, mainly in the south of England. So very pleased to meet you today, Kevin.
Hello.
Hi.
Welcome, Kevin, and thank you for joining us. You've had a very long career in the prison service. What attracted you to working in the prison service in the first place, and also ending up down south, quite a long way from home?
So I had some parameters set for me by my dad over many years. My dad worked in the building industry and was a plasterer, and he used to hate coming home covered in dirt. And he used to say to me, whatever you do, son, get a clean job. So that kind of focused me away from a very hard job in the building trade. So when I got to a position where I was at grammar school and I'd just done the A-levels, I didn't want to go to university and wanted to get straight into a job. And I was very fortunate to get a job at National Savings in Durham, where I worked for about 3.5 years. I had a lot of spare time. So I also applied to be a special constable within Durham Constabulary, and for about 2 years, every Friday and Saturday night, I patrolled the streets of Durham, which was very enjoyable, and in fact almost to the point where I was considering a career swap and going into the police. But a lady called Linda sat opposite me at work at National Savings, and she kept talking to me about all the wonderful jobs her husband had done in the prison service, something I'd never even considered. And they were just about to retire and do all these wonderful things. So I think she brainwashed me in the end. So I applied for both prison service and police. I don't think the police ever got back to me. I must chase that at some point. It's been quite a while. But the prison service, it took about a year to get in. It was national recruitment at the time, so you could get sent anywhere in England and Wales. There was a bit of a problem to one gentleman that joined my course who couldn't understand where nobody got transferred into a prison in Scotland, and then we had to tell him it was a totally different service. So he was a bit worried about where he was going to end up. But I did 2 weeks observational training, wandering around Durham prison, looking and getting a feel for what prison was like, if you can, in just 2 weeks. And then I reported to rugby at the Prison Service Training College, Newbold Revel, 9-week course. And at the end of the 4th week, you got given an envelope, and it told you where you were being posted. And mine said Aylesbury. I didn't even know where Aylesbury was. But luckily the chap that was sat next to me, Brian, got Grendon. And he said, I've got a big caravan. Do you fancy getting together and pitching it up on a farm near Grendon Underwood, and you can drive to Aylesbury and I'll go. So we did that, and that's how I ended up both moving down south and starting my career in my long relationship with Aylesbury.
That sounds a little bit unconventional in terms of your living arrangements, but also that the idea of being attracted to the police as well as the prison service might suggest that you quite like to have some danger or excitement about your work.
I think it's more about my dad had been in the RAF as well, because after the war you still got national service, and he did a lot of work in the RAF and quite enjoyed that. And my dad used to do quite a bit of charity work as well. So I used to just feel that I didn't want to waste the opportunity that could present itself with my work in life, and just do something that was quite meaningful. So although the police kind of sort of fell into just doing something that just felt really interesting and worthwhile, I just was really attracted to the prison service, and that bit about having that opportunity. It sounded like the Miss World answer, but it was to just make people's lives a bit better, and if I could change other people's in a really meaningful way, right from the very start was what I was thinking, then that would be great. I mean, there were awful stereotypes of prison officers where in the end, porridge was probably the best working example you could come up with of, all the different types and personalities. But people were just saying to me, but Kev, you're so nice. Why are you joining the prison service? Do you not think you're going to fit in? So there was a little bit of worry about, whether I'd just got it wrong. And I always remember every time I've been fortunate to be promoted and selected to work somewhere, funnily enough, except Grendon, there's always been that thing of me walking up the drive going, what have I done? As I'm just about to walk in, because I've been really fortunate that every job I've done, I've really enjoyed. So there was that urgent need to move on to something else. So there was a little bit of worry. I mean, there is always the danger bit. I mean, having been a police officer on the streets, calling urgent assistance for you and your colleague, having to manage and control somebody, and being told on the radio it's going to take 20 minutes for somebody to come and help you. In that prison environment, if you do need assistance, it's normally 20 seconds. So the prison environment soon felt a lot safer. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you get out and about and amongst them and get to know people and spend the time learning about people, you then understood who the dangerous people were and when they were likely to become dangerous. So you knew all your client group. A person comes up to you on the street, you don't know their motives, you don't know what they're capable of. So I just felt much safer in that environment, and the staff were really good and very supportive. They understood the work that we were trying to do. I mean, having come from the police though, the crown epaulets, I thought everybody was a superintendent when I first went into prisons. I couldn't understand where the crown had come from and where's all the officers. So I didn't tell anybody that because I just thought it'd maybe look silly. But no, I mean that was the That was the main concerns really, but they were soon alleviated.
And you touched on another aspect of being a prison officer that I think's a bit of a challenge, that those stereotypes of prison officers, the stereotype is of somebody who's harsh and a bit brutal.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it was like managing that throughout your career.
So you've got to walk your own path. You can learn from other people, and you can see techniques, skills, and you think, oh, I could do that, I could carry that off, that would work. Equally, you sadly see things where you think, I will never do that. I will never ever do that. That was wrong. And fortunate for me that Aylesbury operated with its probationary staff, those in their first year of service, a parent officer scheme, where you get paired up with somebody who works your weekend and on your unit. And I was very fortunate, and I will give him a proper shout out because I always do. John MacDonald was my parent officer, and I watched John do his job, and he did it with discipline, but he did it with humour, and he did it with equality. And as a man, he could control 70 young offenders just by walking around. He could have a laugh and a joke with them, but when John needed something done, they knew it and they just did it. And I just thought, do you know, if I could be 50% like John, I've cracked this. Because, he's amongst them, he knows the guys, he's sympathetic to them, all that sort of stuff. But when the job needs done, John can do it. And then, that mutual respect. So I was seeing some really, really very strong and positive examples, which matched my personality as well, which helped, about how certain people with certain styles in certain situations could actually do the job very well. And I think that was my biggest learning curve coming in. But the stereotypes I had to challenge myself on were with working and looking after people of colour. Because coming from the northeast, I had never, apart from one girl who sat next to me who was on an exchange from Somalia, I'd never physically met another person of colour. And a lot of the stereotypes and a lot of the population at Aylesbury was 50-60% black. And I had to be very conscious that I was allowing myself to make my own opinions and get to work with a lot of people that didn't come natural to me, and just see them, which was my starting point anyway, as just some other people that were in my care. But I was just very conscious that those were the stereotypes that I'd become exposed to, that I was just very sensitive to when I started doing the work, and to make sure that, having been exposed to working with people and scenarios, that I didn't then paint a similar stereotype with people in the community. If I saw 5 white guys stood on a corner, I treated them the same, as 5 any other people of any other colour. And that was the stereotype I was very conscious of when I first came to Aylesbury.
Do you think being conscious of that allowed you to reflect in a way that made it easier to kind of like make changes? Sometimes people aren't able to acknowledge those kind of biases in themselves, are they?
No. I mean, yes, I think it was, because I was very, very conscious. I mean, the first couple of weeks into the job, I did the exact scenario I tried to guard myself against. And I walked into town with a civilian jacket on, but everybody knows your prison because of the trousers and the chain and all that. And I saw 5 black guys stood on a street corner. And I immediately went into observation security mode. And I felt myself do it. And within seconds, challenged myself and went, what are you doing? This is madness. So it was really nice that my own personality and upbringing made me challenge immediately what my brain was thinking and correct it within seconds, and almost laugh about it, realising that was something that was, starting to trigger in me because of my previous 2 weeks experience of working in a prison setting. And I've allowed myself to do that reflective thinking more so in the last sort of like 10 years, where I've had to think about, why did I do something like that? Why didn't this work? Not necessarily around that sort of subject, but on all subject matters, just to kind of make sure that I'm self-checking myself, to make sure that I'm not just saying, I'm the governor and I know best, when you don't always. And you have to be open to those challenges and reflect on those challenges and hopefully make better decisions.
Yes, that's really helpful to hear that's your experience in terms of role modelling to other people, because I think too often we do just slot into routine ways, or habitual ways of thinking, don't we? But if I could take you back to when you started at Aylesbury, I'm aware that lots of people don't want to work within young offenders institutions because they see young offenders as being more problematic to manage in terms of behaviours. I wondered what it was like for you, because you must have been quite young yourself when you went there.
Yeah, so I remember a gentleman, Mr. Smith, come up to me and told me in no uncertain terms I had to respect my elders, which I wasn't expecting, as somehow he found out that he was older than me. I mean, my experience is exactly what you say, that if you have experience of working with young offenders, and I had no choice, if I wanted to the job, then that's where I had to go. It's a very Marmite situation where you either love them or you hate them, and you just can't get your head around that energy and, growing the pair of eyes in the back of your head that you have to watch what's going on. And I think it's very much horses for courses, and I quite enjoyed working with them. Most of the guys that were at Aylesbury were all long-term young offenders, so there was a significant lifer population, and seeing them get their head round the fact that they had an awful long length of time in custody, going beyond the YOI estate, was very interesting. But the vast majority of the staff group there got it, understood it, and wanted to work with them, and there was very little staff churn. Most people, the vast majority of people, left Aylesbury either on retirement or on promotion and went somewhere else. So, and it's one of those I've worked in a number of prisons, but it is very much a prison that absolutely gets in your blood. For some reason, it was built in 1847. It's a proper Victorian prison, originally opened as a female establishment with an adult and a younger person's area at the side of the jail, and it's had a huge amount of history. But for some reason, the staff group is probably one of the best I've ever worked with, because of the skills that they had to manage, support each other and everything else with that population. But it was one of those very difficult environments, but the staff kind of gelled together and got you through it, really. But it was the environment that I absolutely learned that it's sometimes the littlest of things that can make such a massive difference, particularly with young offenders, who you can see, if you hit that sweet spot, almost change over the weekend, their whole way of thinking about a certain thing. And I remember that when I was the cleaning officer on C Wing for about 3 years, I had a guy called Lawrence who was my number one cleaner, and the shift pattern meant that you worked every other weekend, and one of those weekend days you worked an evening duty. And as the cleaning officer, I was allowed by management to get a cleaner out to clean the hot plate and clean the showers, and then put them away last. But I always used to keep Lawrence out and make him a cup of tea and just have a chat with him for 5-10 minutes, just check that he's okay and what was going on with him and with his family and stuff, and then put him behind his door. And then fast forward many decades, and I ended up being the Governor of Aylesbury, and the press office convinced me to do a programme called Aylesbury Prison. And basically a camera crew had all access, and video had been filmed for about 3 months and then made a programme. And Lawrence was sat at home, and his wife said, "That prison where you were in when you were younger is on the telly." And he said, and he came in the room and looked, and there I am, his personal officer, waxing lyrical about the prison as its governor. And bless him, having never ever heard from him, and why would you, he sent me a congratulations card. And it's one of my most treasured possessions. And basically what he said was, he said, the nicest thing about you, and the biggest thing that made such a difference, was instead of on a Sunday night giving me a cup of tea out of an urn that's had the tea in it for about 5 hours, and it's lost any resemblance of tea, you'd think nothing of going in the office and getting an officer's mug. Bear in mind they had these plastic awful things. Using a Thai food tea bag, a proper tea bag, and make me a cup of tea and giving it to me. And you never thought anything of that. He said, but that was such a generous thing to me. And then it was your conversations with me for 5-10 minutes on a weekend that kept me out of trouble, because I didn't want to let you down. And I just thought that was such a powerful thing. You know, and I've led officer-led offending behaviour courses, some very basic ones that we did at Aylesbury, like a week long. And they work with people, absolutely. But with certain people, just those little moments of kindness can just crack open a door. And it certainly worked with him. And I just felt very grateful for the fact that he shared that with me, because it had such a profound effect on me. It still does, as you can probably tell from my voice.
Yeah, it's really touching, moving to hear you give that account. And I think those moments with people inside prison have repeatedly come through on our podcast when we've interviewed people who have lived experience. They talk about those moments where they're treated in a very human way, and how powerful that is because somebody's seeing their value. So yeah, thank you. That's really, really important. As you were talking, you could hear your passion for the work with young people, and I suppose it reminded me, and when you spoke of it also as being a bit like Marmite, and it reminded me of working with people with a diagnosis of personality disorder, because I think that's another kind of work that people either love it or hate it, and either find it too challenging personally to develop relationships with people with those kind of difficulties, or find themselves really passionate about it and then staying in place for a very long time. Is that your experience, David?
Well, they do, but I was trying to think from Kevin's wonderful vignette there of his interaction with Lawrence. Was Lawrence, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
What a perfect example that was of what we kind of rather glibly refer to as relational working these days. And the issue is always how does one teach colleagues, or indeed oneself, how to interact and form relationships in just this way, rather than responding perhaps to one's initial impulse to kind of push people away or keep people at a distance.
Yeah, I always used to say that the two biggest qualities that a prison officer should have, and they were certainly the things that I asked what the Governor of Durham was interviewing me for when he selected me for the training, and he said it's sense of humour and common sense, because those are the two things we find really hard to drill into somebody or train somebody. If you've got them, anything else we can normally manage around. And the training itself is, I mean, it's been amended and looked at so many different times. And there's almost too much of a focus on control and restraint and security, and a lot of people don't have martial arts skills or come from that sort of background, and they just find it that whole part of it, alien but necessary. And they're almost just waiting for the first time they could use it to get confidence. And they're almost like on a hair trigger. And when I did the training, although in the 9-week course, there were quite a few sessions in control and restraint. What was nice was there was an equal amount of training in interpersonal skills and about watching videos without sound, where you immediately become sceptical of the prisoner who stands next to another prisoner and slips him a note, and you think, oh, drug dealing, all that sort of thing. And you get into this whole maelstrom and build up this massive scenario. And then, of course, the instructor plays it again with sound. And it's a prisoner who's very embarrassed that he hasn't learned how to read yet. And he's passing the note to a friend so that he can read it by himself and then come back and tell him what the letter says. So it was all those sort of things about not misjudging scenarios and suspending your own prejudices and everything else, and just how to talk to people and and there was loads of different scenarios. You're on a train, you get up to the toilet, you come back, somebody sat in your seat, refuses to move. How do you easily relatable scenarios. And yeah, I mean, it is quite difficult, I think, for people to kind of get that right balanced approach from day one, because it's what the staff's anxiety is about. And as a prison officer, I obviously remember what it's like to be a prison officer in 88 to 93, but as a governor, you never want to say, yeah, but it was worse in my time. You don't want to swing the lantern. So a couple of times I've actually put uniform on and not told anybody, and just gone into the detail and said, where do you want me? And it's really funny because everybody, normally the prisoners see the bright white shirt and they come up to you and they think you're fresh out of rapping. And as soon as you start talking to them, they're like, where have you worked before? You've been here before. And when I've gone on visits, you mentioned I worked for the executive director in the last couple of years. And I used to go on visits and wander around the wings just to do an assessment of where we thought they were and help with the feedback. And it was really sad talking to some of the inmates, and they were just saying, when you're just having a laugh and a joke with them and asking how they are, and they just went, you've been in the job a long time, haven't you? And I said, how do you know? And they said, because you know how to talk to us. And I just think that's that's such an obvious skill that we're somehow missing a trick, and I'm not too sure I've got a solution. But it was just a really funny thing that people inside would immediately know you've got a bit of service in you, and because you can just talk to people. And I just think it's so sad that they have to make it that obvious a statement to you when you're interacting with them.
Mm. And how much training? What training do you have to prepare you to be a governor?
Oh, it's all experience, I think. I mean, I was very fortunate that I had 5 years at Aylesbury, where sadly the number of incidents and the difficulty of the population kind of taught you some basic skills, and you certainly learned how you want to be treated in difficult times. And then the Deputy Governor called us up to his office one day and said, we'd like you to go on the accelerated promotion scheme. So that allowed me to have very quick experiences at different levels of management in a number of different establishments. So I went to Bullingdon. I was a residential principal officer on A-Wing, dealing with the Rule 43 protected residents, as well as those on going on short-term sentences. And then I was promoted into the governor grades in the old money of G5, where I worked in a security group for a year. And then I had to work in a Cat C, so I got the choice of working at Grendon or at the Mount. And at that point, I felt the Mount would be better for me, so I went to the Mount. And then as soon as you got your G4, you're off the scheme. So for me, it was very much that rich experience of working with different SMTs, working with different managers, and then as a governor, as a deputy governor, I worked in 3 establishments over 7 years with 7 different governors, which was such a rich vein of information. Some of them were exceptionally good governors. Some of them were very specific to their roles. Some of them had not so great days. And that was a very, very rich learning curve for me. I was very fortunate enough to do the Masters at Cambridge in criminology and business. That was a very useful course for me to go on and just get wider experience of different services and stuff. So with me, it was very much my own personal experiences, where I worked, who I worked with, that gave me my experience and knowledge about how I feel would be the most effective way in which I could operate and use my time, rather than say there was a specific course. Although as part of the accelerated promotion scheme, there were some significant chunks of learning that you went away for a couple of months to get experience. But having already had 5 years in the service, that was a massive advantage to me when I was on that, and hopefully myself and the other colleagues that had previously been prison officers for quite a while helped those colleagues that were coming from university and entering into it in a very more structured but abrupt way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And although you didn't choose to go to the Mount to Grendon at that point, you went to the Mount. You did eventually become deputy governor at Grendon, didn't you? And I wondered what that experience was like. How did you find it compared to working in some of the other prisons?
It was the best time of my career for a continuous amount of time in that role. I'd been the deputy governor of Aylesbury, and Grendon came up, and although it was the same role, it was an increase in rank because at the time you were for those who don't know, Grendon is built in the grounds of Spring Hill, so you get 2 prisons for the price of one. One's an open prison, and the other one's the internationally renowned therapeutic prison. So that was a great opportunity. Going back to my time in the caravan, I used to come back and Brian used to talk about therapeutic communities, and I used to talk about alarm bells and incidents. And he said, I don't think you can crack an evening in a TC. And I said, I don't think you could crack running up and down the stairs, to be honest, in a YY. So we swapped. And Brian took me around the therapeutic community, and he came round Aylesbury. So I had a very early taster of what life was very different. And so when I went there, Tim Newell was the governor, and I had the pleasure of working for him for 6 months, and it was very different. The differences mainly stand out were there was a much slower pace to change, and that was because of a very clear need for communication and for people to be consulted at all levels, including obviously the men in the communities. Which kind of made sense. And there were also, you could have incredibly honest conversations with people, whether you wanted them or not, where people were very open to give you their opinions and advice. And I quickly learned the time limits of meetings, because nothing overran. And if you literally and flippantly said, can we have 10 minutes? People would automatically look at the watch at the start of a meeting, and you got 10 minutes. So I learned very quickly not to say, can I have 5 minutes with you? Because if it needed to be an hour, it needed to be an hour. But also, what it was like with the communities was you could be held accountable by them, which was a very interesting concept, which some staff just couldn't understand, how a community could ask you to come to them and explain something, to come to the wing meeting and, basically say, why you did what you did, and almost try and justify it. And some people just didn't feel open to that challenge. And probably my greatest achievement at being the deputy governor there for 5 years was that I never got asked to come to a come to a community to do that. So I must have got something right. But it was an interesting place, and I always describe it as the best way to do business, because of that consultation, because of bringing people with you rather than doing things unto them. Was an absolute great lesson to live through and learn, and see it work, and just have that constant check to make sure that everything was working well. But as soon as people stopped talking, you knew there was a problem, and you had to get to kind of the bottom of what had gone on. But the biggest, I mean, there was various titles the person had, but the director of therapy, the person at the top of their pyramid, and I was kind of the top of the pyramid of the operational side. So probably one of the key relationships was the relationship I had with the director of therapy, or the director of therapeutic communities, or whatever various title they had as it evolved. And obviously with the governor as well. So, just making sure that the operational side, which I found to be quite mistrusting of therapy, and the therapeutic side, who seemed to feel that what they were doing was always right. And there was always that tension and rub. And it was always just like tacking a very flimsy ship, like a yacht, as something would always pull, but just getting an understanding and using that. Well, we want to talk, so let's talk about some of the issues. Let's talk about some of the sticky stuff. Let's see if we can at least understand or agree to disagree, and then just move on. And that was probably the most challenging, but yet most rewarding, because when it worked and we got through difficulties together, then that was probably one of the most rewarding times, because as a senior manager, you knew why it was working, and you knew that everybody was on board with it. So you weren't a governor sat in isolation in an office saying, right, today we're going to do this, issuing a notice, and then you don't know whether it's going to work or not. And that experience stood me in incredibly good stead when I then governed 3 prisons myself.
You touched on something there that I had wanted to ask you about anyway, actually, because I was just thinking about the long period that you did in service, where things must have changed with a big influx of civilian staff over that time. And obviously being at Grendon, you were working alongside psychotherapists and presumably a psychiatrist. And I just wondered if there were any other lessons from that you could offer up to people about working with people that are coming from different philosophical or professional backgrounds, in order to make that tension work well and be in the benefit of everybody, rather than be a friction that can be more destructive.
Don't be humble and be prepared to ask. What do you do? Mm-hmm. What works well? What do we do that doesn't make you work well? And have those honest, basic answers. People, when you get to a certain rank, they think a switch turns in your head and you get unlocked all this knowledge, and it isn't. And you are seen to be all knowledgeable, and that's not the case. And there are some incredible people, particularly at Grendon, who used to manage huge amounts of risk, that unless you sat down with them as a psychologist or a therapist or one of the other specialists that were there, and just tried to just have a coffee with them, and just say, what's your issues, what's going well, what's not going well, what do you do? And just don't be afraid to ask, and just get an understanding. And then, like I say, if you can work out where the rubs are and try and work things better, but you can be absolutely certain that you're not the only person that doesn't know what they do.
Yeah.
And there's a natural kind of fear of asking that sort of question, because you don't want to look like you're not in charge, or you don't understand because you've worked with psychologists for a long time. Of course I know what they do. And then somebody says, what do they do? You don't know the answer. Well, you know an answer, but it's not a very accurate one. And there was some fascinating work done, with some of the disciplines like art therapy and things like that. And I had to, before the product of the art therapy was allowed to be taken out of the establishment, just to make sure that there was nothing on there that would compromise security, I volunteered to be the one that would look through it. And the therapists were incredibly caring, and it surprised me to the level of care that they showed towards me for what I was about to expose myself to. These drawings of very, intimate periods, or, actions in a person's life that they've expressed. And although I'm not trying to decipher it or anything else, I'm just literally looking to make sure there's nothing that compromises security. They were still concerned about what I would see, how that would affect me. And that was a genuine concern, and I was grateful for it. So just getting an understanding of their work and how they interact, what they can do, what they can't do. And like I say, just trying to make sure that that every department's like a jigsaw piece, and everything slots together and works well, and there's an understanding of the work. And I think we started to do some of that work, and hopefully some of it was completed in the years. But yeah, it is getting used to the different disciplines, and some are more obvious than others. And there's of course colourful characters. some are more might be more approachable than others, but it is important to have those conversations. And when you first get to a place, that's the perfect opportunity. I'm the new, I need to understand what's going on. Apologies for the stupid question, but I'm going to ask it, and then see where that takes you, really.
Yeah, the importance of acknowledging not knowing, which also sounded like an important lesson for the psychologists and therapists as well, to not retreat into a defensive know-it-all position, but to be able to be humble about what they don't know also. So, thank you.
I think one of the key things is to, in those conversations, difficult as they might be, is to acknowledge the things that can't change, because it's pointless spending hours discussing the things that can't change. But, I always use the example that we have to paint all the rooms blue. So that's an order, we have to do it. But how we paint them, in what order we paint them, and what colour blue we use, we can have a great discussion about that. But the fact that none of us like blue because it's a cold colour, that's not going to get us anywhere. So, and that sometimes can be the most difficult part of the conversation. But I think once you get that baseline in the conversation, then you can then move on, because you know the parameters.
Some great examples there, Kevin. And I just want to bring you back to Grendon, because of course that's where we met and we worked together there, and they were dramatic times, as I remember. I think we worked under 3 different number 1 governors, and during my time there and your time there was the worst thing that can happen to a prison. There was a serious escape, and 3 prisoners managed to escape through the wire, which was a shocking event. What was that like for you, and how did you manage to balance the needs of the operational group and the expectations of the therapeutic regime at that time?
So I remember it. I couldn't remember the day, but I very much the date. Sorry, but I very much remember the call. I wasn't in the prison that day, and Joe, who was a very experienced manager, rang me up and he said, Kevin, and I could hear his voice shaking, we've had an escape. And I said, Joe, how many times do I have to tell you? An abscond from Spring Hill is not an escape. And he went, we've had 3 get out from the sports field at Grendon. And I went, oh. And he went, the governor says he wants to let you know, but you're not to come in. So the first thing I had to do was explain to the governor why I was sat in his command suite. I mean, it was obviously devastating for Grendon itself. The fact that we weren't told about it or had any snippets about it was probably the thing that hurt us the most. Despite the fact, of course, when the men were being called in from the sports field, there was a couple of them said to the member of staff concerned, you might want to check your numbers. So they were kind enough to let us know then that we knew something had gone wrong. And then, of course, in the hours afterwards, we were able to share some information and intelligence with the police, which allowed them to recapture the men very quickly. But I just knew that, the eye of headquarters was going to descend on Grendon. The local community, there'd been reputational damage against Grendon within the service. I knew very much that senior managers in the service were going to have concerns about its security and what we were doing there, and that obviously would cascade up to ministers and things like that. So, luckily, the worst sanctions weren't imposed on Grendon. It didn't have to change its regime. We had some security enhancements done, which is kind of what you'd expect. But it was more about managing that anxiety that became very self-centred for obvious reasons, both within the staff group who had invested terribly in the place, and also the vast majority of the men that were in therapy wanting to get the best out of Grendon and felt that was in jeopardy. And some of them remembered what had happened when Grendon had to be evacuated because of electrical problems and how that disturbed everybody having to work in different prisons. So it was more about only doing what we needed to do to give that assurance, the minimum that we needed to do that we felt we could manage, so that security didn't become almost like a strangulation to the site, and to allow therapy to breathe and allow it to do its best work, which is allow the men to reflect on what they were thinking, support each other through their anxieties, and obviously manage a lot of individuals, some of which who knew and didn't say, and whether they were going to open up in the groups or not about that, or one-to-one in some sessions with staff or therapists. That was the thing that we felt we needed to make sure happened, so that the communities could come together, digest, analyse, and then hopefully come to some form of peace with what had happened, and obviously allow them to look very closely at what we were doing as the senior managers, so that everything we were doing could be seen to be proportionate and not an overreaction. We were very keen to try and do that, and hopefully, with the vast majority of people, we succeeded.
Yeah, I remember it as being a very chastening time, really. It's kind of certainly pricked my bubble of arrogance and overconfidence, and highlighted just how dependent the different groups of activity, therapy and operational teams were, how reliant we were upon each other, actually.
Yeah.
But of course, an extraordinary experience for you. I think the Deputy Governor carries a huge amount of responsibility in those situations, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's again, it's just managing, some of the staff saying, "Well, I told you so," and just making sure that we, as I said, we didn't overreact and make sure that everything was proportionate, but also that we could just get back to normal as quick as possible. So, because I think the longer you stay in the abnormal state, the greater the anxiety. And I think, everybody understood it was a significant event that would have, far-reaching impact on, as I say, our reputation and potential future. But everybody also knew that it was just something we had to get through. A lot of the guys were saying, well, I used to say to them, you know what's going to happen? Oh yeah, we do this, we do that, and then we get back to normal. I went, yeah, exactly. I said, you've probably lived through this in other establishments, but the staff may not have done here. So you need to support them as much as they support you. And, a lot of the staff were really troubled by it all, and were testing their own feelings about what happens when they're in therapeutic meetings or just the wing meetings in their communities, about how truthful people are and how honest and open people are. And I think it did take some people quite a bit of time to reflect, readjust, reevaluate, and then settle again and take things again at face value, because they'd been jarred, shook up by such a serious and significant event.
But it sounds from the way you're talking about it, Kevin, that you kind of learned a lot from that situation.
Yeah.
Would you say that?
Yeah, and I think it's as much as how you've interacted with the place and built those relationships up before that watershed moment hits, that when you say to people, we will get through this, people will hopefully believe you. And when you're saying, this won't change, but we're going to have a look at this, and that I've always tried to be open and honest with people, and if they see you're in a crisis, and you continue to be open and honest with people, and if you don't know, you say you don't know, and if you need to get back to somebody, you get back to them. It was that sort of thing really, and just the importance of keeping that level head, and not losing, what's that phrase that you try and keep your head while all those about you are losing theirs. That doesn't stop you from having those anxieties and those one-to-one discussions with the governor, and where you each can, in that sort of special relationship, sort of like share your darkest concerns. Then you have your rational moment, and then you carry on, because nobody else is going to understand better than the people in those two positions about what it could mean, both personally, but also for the wider establishment as well. So yeah, it was a difficult time, and it was a crucial time as well, because it was the handover of governors, I seem to remember.
I was going to say that this was a period of great instability as far as number one governors was concerned. There were three in rather rapid succession, and I think it's probably a kind of major, not quite invisible, but almost invisible achievement of your life, your career really, Kevin, of seeing Grendon through that extremely difficult time, so that it was able to continue.
I always say that one of the greatest privileges of a deputy governor is to manage transition between two governors. And although you've got the same job to do in the same place, that different personality, different priorities can be a huge settling, and particularly when one governor, in the example we're using, had been there for 10 years and very much was the lifeblood of the place. And I remember when I was in charge for that very brief moment of time, one of the community leaders came to me and said, are you signing the release on licence for some of the Grendon men to go out for short periods of time as part of resettlement? I said, yeah. And he said, what you need to do though, Mr. Leggett, is look at every application as if it's the first one. And I said, why is that? Because some men have been out multiple times. And they went, because your signature is not the signature of the previous governor. And they don't want to let him down personally. And I went, wow, okay. We still let people out, but, I didn't take anything into account on how good their previous absences has been. And that just showed to me. And actually that governor, which I found very interesting, referred to Grendon as the inheritance. It wasn't a prison, it wasn't a job. He was saying, Kevin, this is an inheritance and it's going to pass to somebody else and they have to look after it and nurture it. And you're responsible for helping with that transition. And it was just such a personal thing to refer to a prison as almost like a living entity, which of course it is, but as such a valuable thing to pass forward. So I ended up doing that twice, which was slightly unexpected, but that's how it went. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It was quite a key and pivotal point in my career.
Okay, thank you. Just to move on a bit. So after Grendon, you went to Huntercombe and Aylesbury, working again with young offenders, and clearly enjoy that. So what is it about young offenders in particular that appeals to you?
I mean, fate dealt me one hand, which was I was the deputy governor at Grendon and Spring Hill, and Nick Pascoe came and said, would you like to be the deputy governor of Huntercombe? And I said, oh, okay, I'll give it a go. And then of course it was juveniles, as they were known as then, the 15 to 17 year olds. And it is right that the younger that the group of prisoner gets, the more demanding and challenging they can be. And I think Huntercombe's population were extremely challenging group, particularly with all the gang activity that seemed to permeate into the prison. Irregardless of what was happening in the prison, it was what was happening in the community, ended up reflecting what was going on. And then when I went back to Aylesbury, it was I'd said to my wife at the time, the next job that gets advertised, I'm going to apply for. And the first job that came out was Aylesbury, so I ended up going back. But yeah, they were very welcome to me, because I'd kind of earned my bread and butter looking after young offenders for 5 years, as we've already said, at Aylesbury. So, I mean, what got me was it just got in my blood, really. It just working with that energy and that moldability of people, and just getting to know them and being interested in them, and that spark that you can create with them, about whether it's just you support the same football team, whether you've had a military career, or you look like an uncle, or you act like the brother they wish they'd had, or the father they wish they had. And they just have that latch onto you, and for some reason that bond that you can create in a very quick time is just so more obvious and so much deeper than you tend to get with adults. And you really feel that you've got a potential to start to change somebody, or just get somebody to recognise where they are, and that just they've got options. And even if no matter what happens, time is their best solution, because eventually everything just passes, and you just got to sit back, where kids tend to want to do everything at 100 mile an hour and 700 things at once. So some of that was kind of key to me. And also around that time I'd become a father myself, so I felt that I needed to pay a bit more attention and continue to be involved with that group. And have that, passive learning about what were the triggers that forced people to feel like they had to do what they did, and to try and sort of like put some things in my own life to try and create that environment where my daughter wouldn't do those things or feel like they had no other opportunity but to do something. So it was very much a continuance of a professional interest, a professional journey with me. But there was, on reflection, very much a learning opportunity for me personally, to hopefully make a quantum leap and become a better father. And if she was sat next to me, she'd probably say I did all right.
I'm sure she would, yeah. So, in an earlier conversation with a researcher called Jane Price, we talked about some of the difficulties that young men in YOIs had in transferring to the adult estate. Do you think more should be done in that particular area?
Well, I certainly felt that at the time. The governor of thinking of my time being at Huntercombe and then at Aylesbury. At Huntercombe, there was a huge amount of quite appropriate resource there to support people who needed that level of support, with social workers and who were on site and just available to do that. Very important, look a person in the eye and have that conversation with them and understand them and build that relationship with them. And of course there was the huge documentation, very rich documentation called Asset, which I eventually became e-Asset because I think it became electronic, which was just this huge portfolio of evidence of the history of the person and their relationships and all the work that they'd done with the social workers, but also in the prison as well. And of course the system didn't allow that to transfer onto the YOI system. So I know that this massive portfolio of documentation, because we had to print it out, would never get looked at by a rushed reception officer, and it would be pushed to one side, and they'd just say to the somebody who'd only just recently been referred to as a child, "Okay, what's your name, mate?" And it was the first impression you got was, "You know nothing about me." And that must have been so isolating for that individual. And the fact that they've left all their friends, they've got the trauma of their living arrangements have all changed. They've no doubt listened to huge amounts of misinformation about that prison because people think it's funny to wind somebody up. Huge amounts of anxiety. And where we found we had we learned from the most difficult of cases and then did everything for everybody, where to get people from the YOI to come and visit Huntercombe, and we would know that arrangements would be made for that person to be on duty for when the child transferred into the adult estate. So it was a familiar face, and they would have conversations with social workers in the preparation for and the movement to. And then we moved that person to the YOI, and if we couldn't do it on the day, a couple of days later the social worker would turn up and say, "How's everything going?" And then sit down and have a try meeting with the new personal officer and just make sure there was that effective handover. You've had a couple of days, you've obviously had conversations, how's it going? To make sure that there was no information lost or no misinformation. And then we found that was quite hard to do with everybody, so it was useful if other prisons could send us photos of what the gate looked like, what reception looked like, what the walk from reception to the induction wing was like. So you could get rid of all the anxieties about what's it going to look like. And if they had local residents who were part of reception red bands who would come and talk to them about the prison and stuff like that, could they do a little piece and send it to us? So that again, they could say, "Well, I wrote to you before you got here to tell you this is what I'm going to tell you in reception." And then we encouraged prisons to just look at what they had in their reception, because we had to do the same. And when I first got to Huntercombe, I wandered round, and the only two things that were in the reception holding room was a poster of the prison service, which isn't really great. It's a colour-coded map of the country with literally just the prisons on it, and an anti-bullying poster. So I said, if I was coming here, the two things I would learn is I'm in the middle of nowhere and I'm going to be bullied, because that's the only two things you've got in the room. So we asked prisons to reflect on that and do something similar with them. So it was certainly how we handed over the person, rather than saw them as just a transfer and we have to move you. Because it's brutal, because it's your 18th birthday, happy birthday, you go into the adult estate, where every other transfer seems to be about need. And there were a couple of cases where we had to fill out a lot of paperwork to keep somebody with us for just a few weeks or months, because it was just detrimental to them to move them, and we got permission to hold them beyond their 18th birthday. But the system needed to be more flexible. It was all about information exchange, and it was a proper handover with a tapering off of our contact and an increase with their contact, I think would be the best thing. And just, if the service could find somewhere, and I hope they have done, but I guess not, of utilising all that information that's been documented onto the YOI system, so that at least people could understand what the trigger points are, what the issues are, what are the things you need to get a grip of straight away, with a person who's going to arrive at an awful time and probably just wants to go to bed. And no matter how much you talk to them, they're not going to talk to you, because they just want to feel safe and be locked in that cell. And if you can do anything to relieve that anxiety, so they want to interact, that the transfer's done in a bespoke way at a reasonable time. I know this all costs money, but you are talking about individuals, and you have almost given me a free rein to suggest things. Those sort of things we found were really useful, and just help with that transition and the check-in afterwards, just to make sure that everything was okay and it was managed.
Thank you, Kevin. That's really helpful. You worked for 30 odd years in one of the most challenging areas of public life, public service. How have you kept yourself sane and emotionally balanced?
Probably my best ability is to switch off when I'm not at work. Despite my best efforts to do so, as a governing governor and deputy governor, people would still ring you in the middle of the night. So I had to, about incidents, so I had to perfect the ability to go to sleep very quickly afterwards, almost to the point where I almost had to question myself, did I have the phone call? But I'd always make notes. So it has been that ability to switch off, really, and do things that aren't connected with the work. So every year I used to challenge myself to do something different. So it might be to do something simple like read for pleasure, because you have to read an awful lot in the job, and reading for pleasure was a thing I had to do. One of the ones I'm thinking about doing is learn to ride a unicycle, which I think is going to be quite painful, but that will certainly concentrate. I learned how to ice skate. I learned how to play ice hockey. I represented the prison service in international competitions, believe it or not. So it was just not to dwell and just have that ability to just do other interesting things, particularly with the family. But you had to have a good break as a governing governor, and the only way you can do that, I don't know if people know, but whilst you're in the country, no matter what you're doing, you are permanently on call, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So in better travelling times, I always used to try and have a weekend away and then a holiday away. So I knew that was time when nobody would contact me. Although having very capable senior management teams, became very few and far between. But it's every time the phone rings, you think, oh, and then you know it's not, and it's just your mother. But it's equally as traumatic at times. But yeah, so that was quite important to do that, and going on a bit about SMTs, senior management teams, they're very skilled people, and try and not be a manager that feels they have to micromanage. Just have an idea about what they're doing, give them direction, let them do it. Hopefully they'll be better than you, and then you've absolutely got the best SMT in the world. But just trust people to do the jobs you're employing them to do. And if you've got it right, any manager should be able to walk away from their job for 2 weeks, and there shouldn't be a pressing need to get in touch with them, because you should have systems and procedures in place to either put things in a holding pattern or deal with them. So if you've invested the right things with the staff to develop them and give them good systems, procedures, then you should be able to do that. You'd like a few things to need to be talked about as soon as you get back in, because then it does mean that they have missed you at least a little bit. But you've got to be able to do that. But it is just the regular breaks, and just have pastimes away from the place, and just try not to bring work home, or if you do it for a set period of time, shut things off and put them away. And I think more and more so now with remote working and iPhones pinging, and you've got to be disciplined. And particularly even the last couple of years where I've worked from home, I still get up at 6, walk the dog, breakfast, work from 7:30, finish at 5. You've still got to have that discipline. But if I want to do different things, that's fine. But you've got to have that downtime. Otherwise, you go. It's not going to do you any favours, and it's certainly not going to do any of the people who work for you or in your care any favours, because you need that time to think, reflect, but also just to rest.
Thank you. That's great. That's really interesting, and I didn't realise that you'd represented the prison service at ice hockey. I can see it now you've mentioned it. I can just picture it.
Yeah, we the 2005 World Police Fire Games were the first games we played in. We had, I think it was 3 months to get a team together, some of which hadn't learned to skate by then. And unfortunately for us, it was held in the beautiful city of Quebec in Canada. Canada being a hotbed of international ice hockey. But it was a fantastic achievement. I can't explain, without getting incredibly emotional, about when the team finished their last game and all of the representatives from the Prison Service Sports Association that funded the games were all waving the Union flags as we left the ice. It was absolutely a special time, and absolutely got the hook in me. I've supported ice hockey since I was 18 years old, and I just don't understand why I waited until I was about 35, 36 years old before I strapped the first set of ice skates on. But I've got one of my best friends to blame for that. So and still play it now. So yeah, it's definitely a great thing, that another thing that's in my blood.
Can't help but wonder as well, as hearing the emotion there, Kevin, as you talk about that, the kind of like pride and that sense of achievement, but you can't help but wonder whether your ability to be in connection with your emotions has also had a lot to do with your success at work, because I think too often people feel like they have to leave their emotions at home, and yet actually we're emotionally rounded individuals tend to do the job better, I think, and your emotions and your ability to connect with them just bring across your humanity, actually, in how you talk about the work.
Thank you. I mean, I've always been both internally and externally very passionate about the job I've done, and I've always considered it to have been an absolute privilege to do that job, but especially to be trusted with the guardianship or inheritance of 3 prisons. And I've always felt very emotionally, physically connected with those jails. Probably more so Aylesbury, just because of the sheer length of time in the 3 times I worked there. And at times, I've never been a person to read off a script when I've done a full staff meeting, because I don't think you get that connection. I just have bull points and I've hit them all, and that's fine. But the danger of that is my mind goes off somewhere else, or I might say an appropriate joke, or I might get emotional. And the times when I've done that, you could hear a pin drop. And people have come up to me afterwards and said, I never realised you were so passionate about that one thing. We will do whatever you need to get that done. And it's not something I've ever played up to. It's not something I deliberately try and get myself into that situation. I hate myself every time I do it, because it really affects my voice, and I can't get it out. But for some reason, well, I think you've said it actually. It's not for some reason. We know why. We're human beings, and we see that sort of like connection with something, and it's important, and it goes a bit beyond. Stuff gets done in a prison if the governor says, this is important. Of course, that does it. But to have that emotional, connection with people, if you could bottle it, if you could identify how you get it, we'd all be millionaires. And some people are receptive to it, and some people aren't. But I've certainly seen my passion for the job I've done and the people I've done it with has been a little bit of a weakness, but one of my biggest strengths.
Well, I think it's courage, Kevin. I think it takes courage to be your emotionally connected self at work, and I think that's probably what people have found really inspiring about you, your ability to do that. And it's been really lovely to get the chance to meet you and have this conversation with you today.
No, I mean, likewise. Like David says, we've known each other for too many years, I think now, and it was just a lovely opportunity for you to invite me on to your podcast, and allow me a very nice opportunity to reflect on my career, and of course to have a chat with you both. So I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope people will find it interesting to listen to.
I'm sure they will.
Thank you, Kevin.
What a lovely man. You could really hear his empathy and compassion for the people that he'd worked with, which just shone through actually, and I'm sure was inspiring to the people that he worked with. But I also found his sharing of what he does to stay uplifted, and that that learning something new every year. And I thought actually throughout his account there were stories about having that kind of like growth mindset, that rather than being rigid and just saying no, wanting to learn and wanting to find ways to do things better each time. Really inspirational, I thought.
Yeah, I agree. It was a real pleasure meeting with Kevin again and having that conversation with him. And I thought he had so many wonderful stories of the way in which he'd managed relationships with people. And also I was struck right at the beginning, he was describing what it was like for him to come down from Durham to Aylesbury. And he gave this description, I don't know if you remember it, of meeting people with, this was in the prison service, meeting people with crown badges on their epaulets and thinking this must mean they were superintendents. And of course the key point about that was what it was like to find yourself in a situation where things were unknown and they were confusing. And then he went on really to describe how that confusion in a way increased for him as he found himself immersed in this very different southern culture. And what a steep learning curve that was for him. And of course he linked that with his understanding of what it was like for these young men shifting from different institutions within the prison estate. So great, really enjoyed that.